Well, hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and I'm beyond thrilled to welcome you to the winter series tonight. It's a new year with all sorts of new opportunities to learn about the past. Tonight, in our Meet the Historian series, we will welcome Kyle Walker and hear all about his new biography on Katharine Smith Salisbury. Tonight is the first of three evenings where we get to hear about some of the latest church history books. So, next week, we will sit with John Dinger and Cheryl Bruno to hear about the life and legacy of William Marks. While in 2 weeks, we learn all about Black Americans in church history with Matthew Harris. You can register for the next 2 nights by following the link that Wendy will drop in the chat. In addition to marking your calendars for our winter book series, we hope you will also include a weekend in Kirtland on April 12th through the 13th. I hope you'll join me that Palm Sunday weekend as we gather with some of Community of Christ great storytellers, people like Lachlan and Kristen McKay, Seth Bryant, John Charles Duffy, to share church history through engaging class sessions, walking tours of the historic neighborhood that surrounds the temple, and exploring the Kirtland Mills Burying Ground. Plus, there'll be plenty of time for conversation and fellowship at the Community of Christ congregation here in Kirtland. This is a joint event between Community of Christ and the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation. The weekend will draw to a close with a Palm Sunday service that'll take place in the lower court of the Kirtland Temple, where soon-to-be Prophet President-elect Stacy Cram will share the morning message. Registration information for this special weekend will be released soon, but in the meantime, mark your calendars for April 12th through the 13th and an enjoyable weekend of church history in Kirtland. And while your calendars are out, you might as well save the dates for a spring lecture series this May. We will be hosting a number of great storytellers over the first 4 Thursdays in the month of May. So stay tuned for additional details about this spring series, as we'll share it all at the end of our current series. Oh, friends, there is a new internship position available in the Alma Blair internship program. Not only is this a great opportunity for professional experience in the field and a paid position, the intern will get to work with people who have lived and breathed church history. It's a hands-on opportunity to preserve the past. So for more information about the position and to apply, follow the link that Wendy will be dropping in the chat. And lastly, friends, none of these online programs, none of these special events and internships would be possible without your generous support. Thank you for your donations and for your monthly gifts. For those who would like to give tonight, you can see there are 3 easy ways to support the Historic Sites Foundation through online giving and gifts through the mail. Wendy will drop the online link in the chat for those wishing to make a donation this evening. We know there are a lot of outstanding educational organizations out there to support, and we thank you for thinking of us. Speaking of great programs and people, joining me tonight are my co-hosts, Peter Smith and Wendy Eaton. They should be familiar faces. Peter serves as a board member for the Historic Sites Foundation, and Wendy serves as the administrative assistant for the Historic Sites Foundation, as well as the assistant archivist for Community of Christ. So welcome, Peter and Wendy. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Speaking of guest speaker, it's a joy to introduce you tonight to Kyle Walker. Kyle serves as an administrator in the Counseling Center at BYU, Idaho. He's been a member of the John Whitmer Historical Association since 2005, where he also served on the board of directors from 2016 through 2019. Kyle's also the immediate past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association. He is the author or editor of 2 books on the Joseph Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith family, and the author of a biography of William B. Smith, which won the Best Biography Award from the John Whitmer Historical Association in 2016, not very long ago at all. But most recently, he published the book we will hear about tonight, which holds the title, Sister to the Prophet, The Life of Katharine Smith Salisbury. Kyle, thank you for being here. I'll turn the spotlight over to you as we are all ready to hear more about Katherine and her story.
Thank you, Barbara. It's great to be with you tonight. I'm excited to be able to talk about Katharine Smith Salisbury. I have a great appreciation for the Smith family, and I began researching on the Smith family more than 20 years ago. And I'll just tell you one story that maybe shows my appreciation, demonstrates my appreciation for the Smith family. When I began researching the family, there's one um, occasion where I was researching with Richard L. Anderson, and he decided to kind of open his files up to me. He had done a little work on the Smith sisters, and so this was down at BYU, and I went up to his office in the library, and he just said, "I don't think I'm ever going to work with this information again." So he just opened his files to me, and as a researcher, that's very exciting. And so I just began copying away on some of these sources he was sharing with me. One of those sources was the only known letter of Catherine's sister Sophronia, as well as many other treasured documents. And as I'm researching away, I lost track of time, and it just so happened that it was Valentine's Day, and I worked for quite some time, and this was in the days before cell phones, and then realized I had lost track of time, and as I came home, I was late for my Valentine's date with my wife, and told her what I was up to, and apologized, and my wife said, "You love Katherine more than you love me," and so, for better or worse, that's my passion for the Smith family. To tell you a little bit about the book I wrote, maybe why Katherine. Um, she's the only sister that you could really write a biography of in the Smith family, and there's just not that many first generation uh, women in Latter-day Saint history that you could write a full length biography about. I would estimate maybe 10 to 15 because the sources are so sparse. But she is one of those individuals born before 1820. There's enough sources on that you could write a full length biography. And so this has been a great experience for me to dig back into these sources and to be able to write about Katherine. You want to look at kind of her place in the Smith family. You can see uh, the children here where she falls. She's the middle daughter uh, of Joseph Smith Sr., Lucy Mack Smith, born in 1813, and she lives longer than any of the family. She dies in 1900, and that longevity meant that she had much time to be interviewed, um, wrote letters, lots of sources on Katherine, particularly during the latter part of her life, which provided a lot of valuable information in writing her biography. Um, Katherine really grows up in Palmyra, Manchester, the farm in Palmyra, New York, Manchester, New York. That's the only childhood home she probably ever remembered. She's about 4 years old when the family moves to New York. And so most of her recollections come from that time period. Um, she grew up, most of her childhood probably centered around farm work and faith. And Katherine adopted a number of chores. She did a lot of the barnyard chores and was very strong and hardy in comparison with her sister Sophronia, whose health was rather fragile. And I think Lucy Mack Smith may have divided the chores based on hardiness. So Katherine is out milking the cow. She's tending the sheep. She would bring them in at night, let them go in the morning to graze. And particularly milking the cow was a chore that she was very fond of. In fact, even up until 1 month before her death, as she was struggling with breast cancer and pneumonia, she was still milking that cow within 24 hours of her death. And so it was a chore that she really relished. Um, Here's a photograph of Katherine in later life, but she was said to be 6 inches taller than the average woman of her day. I estimate that to be around 5'9", 5'10" inches tall. Um, Very hardy, like I mentioned, very strong. Descendants remember that she could do the work of most men. Um, there's even some comments on her hands. You can see her hands in this photograph. Had strong, rugged hands. very strong. In fact, in Nauvoo at one point, when times were fairly precarious for the saints, she was hesitant to step outside the door sometimes because she was afraid she'd be mistaken for a man. And so worried about her safety at certain times in Nauvoo. This just gives you a glimpse into some of the work efforts of some of the daughters of the Smith family. This comes from Stephen Harding, who later served as a governor of Utah, but was raised in Palmyra area. He went to dinner with the Smith family. He said, I saw two stout, barefooted girls, Katherine and Lucy, I believe, each with a tin bucket of red raspberries. Soon after, the old man, Joseph Sr., announced that supper was ready. We went into the other part of the house where supper was waiting, consisting of brown bread, milk, and an abundance of fine raspberries. There was no lack of these, and if any left the table without a really good supper, it was not the fault of the hostess. I remarked that the supper was good enough for a king, and the berries on the table were better than could be bought in any city in America. So just kind of a glimpse in there to the work efforts of the Smith daughters and Lucy Mack Smith. Also, her faith is noteworthy in her childhood. She was taught to read from the Bible by her mother and her father. The Smith family had prayers morning and night, and they would also sing hymns while upon bended knee, according to William, every night. And so that's the kind of environment that Katherine grew up in. Lucy Mack Smith one time in Nauvoo commented on some of those efforts. She said to a gathering of saints at Nauvoo, where she emphasized the central role that religious instruction had played in her approach to child rearing. I raised them in the fear of God, she began. From the age of 2 or 3 years old, I told them I wanted them to love God with all their hearts. I told them to do good. She then recounted how she had taught her children the stories of the Bible from a young age about Joseph in Egypt and such things. She underscored that if mothers listening to her that day would do the same, when they, your children, are 4 years old, they will love to read the Bible. So that started very young for Katherine. She attended Sunday school in the Presbyterian church, where they would learn to memorize passages from the New Testament. And when you look at Katherine's letters later in life, they're just brimming with biblical passages. And so you see that influence of Lucy Mack Smith, in particular, on her daughter. And I think Katherine is a lot like her mother. Even her appearance was more like the Mack side of the family than it was the Smith side of the family. She does recount some details about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. A couple of highlights from the book I'll just share with you. She said, we had supposed that when Joseph should bring the plates home, the whole family would be allowed to see them. But he said it was forbidden of the Lord. We therefore had to be content until they were translated and we could have the book to read. But Katherine, and her curiosity, much like Emma, left an account that's very similar to this. She said that she felt of the plates. She described how she hefted the plates and found them very heavy, estimated they weighed about 60 pounds. She then examined them more closely, rippling her fingers up the edge of the plates, and felt they were separate metal plates, and heard the tinkle of the sound they made, noting they were held together by 3 rings. So a firsthand account of the plates in their home. And you kind of start to pick up this sense with the Smith family that, when Joseph can't initially retrieve the plates, Lucy Mack Smith says in her history that the entire family redoubled their efforts so that they could be worthy to be able to bring forth this record. And so in later life, Katherine says, I stand before you a remnant of the family that brought forth the sacred record. So it wasn't just Joseph's mission, it was the entire family to help bring forth this record. And she often left those accounts for her children in later years. A couple other quotes. She said, we got a chest and locked the records up in the house. From that time on, our house was searched all around, and our field and our wheat stacks were searched. The mob was around our house nearly every night, she said. And one night they went into Father's cooper shop and tore up his floor and dug the earth up. Now, I don't know if the mob was actually around the house every night, but the fact that teenage Katherine remembered it that way, I think, is significant. And it kind of highlights some of the fearfulness, the apprehensiveness of some of these outsiders that they felt like were trying to get the plates for them. She did recount one specific incident where she and her sister Sophronia helped protect the plates. Apparently, Joseph had been outside of the house with the bundle. Katherine opened the front door just as her brother Joseph came rushing up, panting for breath, and in a gasping voice whispered hoarsely, "Take these quickly and hide them." Katherine, obviously prepared for such a circumstance by this juncture, took the bundle from Joseph to her room where she and Sophronia slept. Sophronia pulled back the covers. Katherine placed the bundle on the bed, and then they replaced the covers, pretending to be asleep. The mob, failing to find Joseph outside, returned to the house to search, but they did not disturb us since we appeared to be sleeping. And that was a story she often shared with her descendants. Katherine leaves some unique details about the migration to Ohio that we don't have in any other source, as her mother Lucy led one of the contingents out of New York to Ohio. She met Jenkins Salisbury while she's still in New York, and they marry shortly after that migration. So Jenkins was from Rushville, New York, about 40 miles south of Palmyra, and joined the church during that first year. So Katherine Jenkins married by Sidney Rigdon at Kirtland, Ohio in 1831. He was a blacksmith by trade. He had apprenticed at that trade in New York during much of his youth. He was fairly inconsistent as a provider, and I talk about that in the book. Some of the challenges he had, struggled with alcohol, and that was a factor in sometimes he would have periods of abandonment with the family for periods of months, which was very concerning to the Smith family and obviously to Katherine. He did march with Zion's Camp in 1834 to try to restore properties in Jackson County, Missouri, and was put in the Quorum of the 70 once he's back in Kirtland. He's expelled from the church in 1833, where one of the reasons was intemperance. And again in 1836, he leaves the church. And then he's outside of the faith for nearly a decade after that time. So Katherine's dealing with that, as well as his intermittent providing for the family. And that was sometimes challenging for the Smiths, and having to step in and help Katherine during the Kirtland period. Katherine will spend time in Kirtland, and she leaves several accounts of the work she did with the Kirtland Temple and also on the converts that are coming into the church. She said, "While we lived in Kirtland, my mother and myself spent our whole time in waiting on the comers and goers, in cooking and washing." Also, Joseph Smith Sr., her father, oversaw women's work efforts on the temple. And so Katherine and Sophronia and their younger sister Lucy, daughter Lucy, all helped to form weaving clubs in Kirtland. And they may have worked on those curtains that were part of where they could divide off sections of the Kirtland Temple. They certainly worked on the clothes for temple workers and lent their efforts to helping build the temple in those ways and build up the church in Kirtland. Jenkins and Katherine, this is a picture of their family. Elizabeth, their first daughter, dies within a few months after she's born. You can see that Lucy, daughter Lucy, and Solomon were born in Kirtland. And then Alvin is born when the family is migrating from Ohio to Missouri, not far from the Mississippi River, born in an abandoned hut there. And as a testament to Katherine's strength, she's traveling the day after she gives birth to Katherine. And Lucy comments on her strength in her history, that it didn't stop Katherine as she continues the migration within days of giving birth. And they stay on schedule despite giving birth en route. Don Carlos, born in the Nauvoo period, and then Frederick later on in 1850. But it gives you a feel for the family. Now, I should mention that if I forget to mention later, that Jenkins dies early. He'll die in 1853. And so Katherine's a widow for almost 50 years. And that'll factor into some of the challenges she faced. Katherine went through an extraordinary amount of hardship in her life, and very difficult. When they migrate to Illinois, Katherine is no longer kind of at the hub of things like she was in Kirtland, where she often spent time at her parents' home. In Nauvoo, she's living in Plymouth, Illinois, which is south of Carthage, and probably some 40 miles from Nauvoo or more. And so she's outside of that hub during that period. Why did she go to Plymouth? Well, William Smith is there, her brother, who purchases a hotel, and she may have worked at that hotel for a time, and some of her other siblings also work at that hotel down in Plymouth. Katherine loved to go to Nauvoo. She was often invited by her mother or Joseph to be able to come to Nauvoo for big events. She's there at the cornerstone lane of the Nauvoo House and the temple. When the Nauvoo Legion would parade, she said that her brother, Don Carlos, was the most handsome man she had ever seen when outfitted in his Nauvoo Legion uniform and on horseback. And she loved the pageantry associated with the Nauvoo Legion. And so she loved to come to Nauvoo, and she felt a sense of loneliness when she had to leave and go back to Plymouth and be apart from her family. She's very close to her sisters, Sophrony and Lucy, throughout her life. Joseph sometimes would have her come for the Christmas season. Katherine's oldest son, Solomon, recalled that each year that the family lived at Plymouth, his uncle Joseph sent for mother and the children to spend the holidays at Nauvoo. And sensing that Katherine and Jenkins and their family were in need, they would often give them presents or gifts. We often visited Nauvoo, where my brother Joseph entertained us royally and gave me silk dresses and other valuable presents, she said, and then sent her home laden with food, money, and clothing. Finances were often a struggle for Katherine, and her family came to her aid during the Nauvoo period as well. And that was something she relished. As tensions increased around 1843-44, Katherine made one more visit before her brother's death at Carthage. And it was in late June that she came. She left an account of visiting with her brothers. She said, "Joseph took my hands tenderly in his, saying, 'Goodbye, Sister Katherine. When this trouble blows over, I shall come down to Plymouth and make you a visit.'" Hiram also bid her goodbye with a tone of voice that I had a deeper feeling that I had ever known him to entertain. I shall never forget that Saturday, June 22nd, when I last saw my brothers alive. It was my farewell to them on this earth. They were dealing with their own hostilities with their neighbors. Solomon recounted that there were notes tacked to her door, to their door that summer, that said, "Get out or be burned out." And they tried to hang on. Jenkins' blacksmith business was finally prospering some down in Plymouth, but just about the time it started to prosper, they felt forced to leave their home. They lost money as they sold their property, and they went through a number of hardships bouncing around adjacent counties and towns in the area. And so it was a difficult time. And just to give you a feel for the family of what it looked like after the summer of 1844, remember, Alvin dies in 1823. Joseph Smith Sr., shortly after coming to Nauvoo in 1840. Don Carlos dies of what we think was pneumonia in 1841. Hiram and Joseph, of course, 1844. And then a lot of people don't know this, but Samuel, just a month later, late July, he also passes away in Nauvoo. So you can get a feel for what the family looked like after the summer of 1844. You've got Mother Lucy, her 3 daughters, and their only surviving son, William, who actually is in the East on a mission for another year. And so the sisters bond again. They support Mother Smith, and ultimately they bounce around to a number of locations. Katherine's in Nauvoo for a time, but this map kind of gives you a feel for where everyone ends up by the mid 1850s. Emma and has remarried by 1847, her and Lewis and the family at Nauvoo. Eventually, Lucy Mack Smith will go there, but the sisters care for Lucy Mack Smith for those 8 years immediately after the summer of 1844. Jenkins and Katherine settle out in Fountain Green. Remember that Jenkins dies 1853. So Katherine is a widow in Fountain Green. Her sister Lucy Milliken and Sophronia move further east to Colchester in McDonough County. And I think they distanced themselves by moving a little further. They distanced themselves from some of the hostilities that were in Hancock County. William goes north up to Elkader, Iowa. You can see on this map. But Katherine settles right among some of her nearest neighbors are those who marched to Carthage. And they tried to keep a low profile. But as you can imagine, that didn't last long. Eventually, they identify her as the sister of the Mormon prophet. And that led to very difficult hardships for her. And being a widow, you can imagine how scary that may have been to live in that area. She's raising her 4 boys. Her daughter marries fairly early, but she's raising these 4 boys on her own. Solomon leaves some accounts about that time period. This is Katharine's oldest son, Solomon. There were no young folks that would invite me to parties or have anything to do with me. I was called a Mormon, boycotted, abused, and slandered. He recalled how the men he worked for would often curse old Joe Smith when he was within earshot, and how their wives refused to let him eat with the others at the dinner table. Even though he was often miles from his own home, in one instance, he began taking Sunday walks and attending Sunday school with a girl who was about his same age, whom he described as handsome as an artist's dream. Solomon felt the affection was mutual until she abruptly quit their excursions. When he finally encountered her and asked if he had done something wrong, the girl's little sister disclosed that their father forbade her going with me because he says, "You are a Mormon, and he does not want anything to do with you." It was a deeply painful experience for Solomon, and he confided in his history that even after 70 years, quote, "it was one of the wounds that has never healed," unquote. As his younger brothers matured, they related similar experiences as Solomon. In at least some instances, they may have been life-threatening. Katharine's son, Don Carlos, who was age 9 in 1850, recalled swimming in a creek below Webster when an older boy named Jack Brody snuck up behind him, put him in a headlock, and began dunking him in the creek. Whether it was true or merely meant to intimidate, Brody boasted that he had been in the mob that killed his uncles and crowed that it would be a service to the community if he killed a Mormon. Don Carlos felt that Brody would have killed him that day if it hadn't been for an older neighbor who happened upon the scene, as Brody repeatedly held his head underwater for extended periods of time. So Katharine even pulled her children out of school and taught them in the home because of some of that animosity that persisted in Hancock County. It was a difficult time. Here's Katharine with her son Frederick on the left. It's probably the earliest photo of Katharine that we have, 1870. Her son Don Carlos, and some of the hardships they experience. Sophronia will actually take Don Carlos into her home in Colchester and provide him with an education, which was denied some of her other children. And it's pretty interesting to look at Don Carlos, the effect that education had on Don Carlos. He went to common school and then cadet school and serves in the Civil War for 3 years. And when he gets back, will go to Nevada, work for the Wells Fargo line. But the influence of that education, Don Carlos had a daughter who was a surgeon, had a son who was a university president, had a grandson who was a professor at Harvard and very successful. And so you see the impact of that education on Don Carlos's line that Katharine's sister Sophronia provided for them. Alvin, I have a chapter on Alvin in the book. Animosity reached its peak. Even after the Civil War, there was this tension between North and South in Hancock County, Illinois. At a political rally, Alvin Salisbury is murdered by one of his neighbor, stabbed to death. And that is, is devastating to Katherine. He has a family, several children, and his murderer actually spends time in Carthage jail. And so I talk a little bit about that in the book and how difficult that was for Katherine. But it also represented a little bit of a turning point with some of her neighbors as they began to support her after that time period, 1880. And the Salisburys kind of win over their neighbors eventually through their good living and the admiration they had for the Salisbury family. Let's talk a little bit about religious affiliation. There's really no branch of Mormonism in that area at the time. No Latter-day Saint factions in that area. But of course, Joseph Smith III becomes president in 1860. In 1865, by that point, Katherine has been visited by some of the mountain saints. Some of her nephews have come through and visited with her. She felt comfortable enough with them to write some letters to them. And this comes from one of their letters in about 1865. A lot of times, I think some of her descendants, Katherine's descendants, or other Community of Christ members feel like the sisters were following Joseph Smith III's leadership from the very first. And that wasn't the case. This letter's from 1865, and Katherine expressed her frustration to some of her nephews in the West. They, Joseph Smith III and his brothers, have entirely forsaken us, she said. They manifest no interest in our eternal welfare, and they have never invited us to come and take a helping hand with them. For my part, I would be exceedingly glad if all of us, the connections, one and all, could live in a society together and believe in one Lord, one Savior, one faith, one baptism. It is the sincere desire of my heart that we could see eye to eye and rejoice in the Holy One of Israel. And so kind of interesting where she's at with that. And that'll change in the coming years. But during the 1860s, that's kind of where she stood. And I think she was a little frustrated that she didn't have more help from those cousins, from her nephews, to be able to fellowship her boys, which she felt like were not following in her faith. And that really concerned her. Another letter is from Lucy Milliken, Katherine's sister, which I think is just interesting on succession. They write a letter to their nephew, John Smith, in Salt Lake City. I think you and all the Smith family should look into this matter, succession, and see if you are not the successors of Joseph the prophet and Hiram the patriarch, and should lead and govern the church in the last days. I do not see how you boys can preach Brigham the successor to Joseph, or that he has any more authority than he had when Joseph died. I never believed it, nor never shall believe it. And so you can kind of get a feel that what was important to them was that a Smith should assume that leadership. And so you pick that up in the letters in the 1860s. By the 1870s, Katherine is really struggling financially. And because she had established with her nephews, she decided to reach out to Brigham Young. And so she writes a letter asking for money to help her build a house in Fountain Green, Illinois. And Brigham Young writes back, "The memory of our beloved prophet is deeply cherished in the hearts of the saints. And for his sake, his relations and members of his family, notwithstanding differences of opinion, are kindly regarded." And so he sends $200 to Katherine to help her build a home. And she's so excited about building this home. She said she's never owned a home of her own in her entire life. And then she wrote again asking for additional funds because she underestimated the costs of her home. And so Brigham Young sends some additional money to her to help her finish her home. And then she continues to petition LDS leaders who help her purchase 40 acres of land in Fountain Green, Illinois. And here's a sketch of her home that a newspaper did out in rural Fountain Green, Illinois, where she lived with her son Frederick and his wife. Katherine wrote to Brigham Young, "My gratitude to you is unbounded. I shall ever pray for blessings to rest upon your venerable head. I will send you my likeness, my photograph, and wish you would send me yours in return, that I may look upon it with thankfulness for the great help you have rendered me in in the hour of my greatest need. And so it's kind of interesting. Katharine has these positive experience with a lot of the mountain missionaries that are coming and going through Illinois. In fact, it's kind of interesting that her letters often include those in the West in the faith. So here's just a few examples of that, both before and after she affiliates with the RLDS Church. May the blessings of heaven rest upon you and all the church, yours truly. This is from your sister in the gospel, she finishes her letter. Your sister in the Church of God, she writes. And so often including those in the West, in the faith, with her. She's very kind to the missionaries who come through, inviting them to come back and stay with her anytime they are traveling through Illinois, and established a warm relationship there. Let's talk about her affiliation with the RLDS Church. In about the year 1872, Solomon, Katharine's oldest son Solomon, has an illness where he is in bed and can't get out of bed. And he has this dream where he's visited by a messenger. And he sort of has this dialogue with this messenger and asks the messenger, well, the messenger asks him, what do you want to do with your life? And Solomon says, well, I want to contribute something. And he says, well, what do you want to contribute? Well, I'd like to do some good in the world. And the messenger tells him, if you want to get better, you need to call for Joseph Smith III. And so Solomon sends for Joseph Smith III. He comes and lays hands on his head, gives him a blessing, and then baptizes him the next day. Solomon eventually recovers, and he's all in with the RLDS Church. He's baptized. He ends up being a leader in the area. They established the Pilot Grove branch, and he is the president, the district president. He'll eventually oversee Nauvoo district and was known as a great preacher in the area. Katharine is also following her son, but maybe even leading out, wanting her sons to be involved with the RLDS Church. And so she's the only Smith sister that's formally rebaptized in the year 1873 by Joseph Smith III. And eventually Joseph Smith III will travel through Hancock, eastern Hancock County, into McDonough County, and baptize many of his cousins. Eventually, all of Katharine's children will join the RLDS Church and affiliate with the church at one point or another. So here you have a picture of Frederick and Solomon at the Kirtland Temple. Frederick will also serve in some leadership positions in the Pilot Grove branch. So Katharine is kind of starting to be viewed as this living link between the original church and the reorganization. And you pick that up. Here's a print by, I think, William Crick that was produced and hung in many RLDS chapels. And if you look over here, you've got Lucy Mack Smith on this leadership print. You've got Emma Hale Smith, and then you've got Katharine Smith Salisbury as well. So I thought that was kind of a neat print that they did up and hung in many of the churches. Katharine is also invited to sit on the stand with RLDS leaders, a very uncommon thing for women in that day. And here's a neat photograph you see of Katharine on the bottom row with the hat, if you can see her there. And to her right is Alexander Hale Smith, who she was very close to. Alexander would often come to her birthday parties and would come out and preach to the branch there. And I think Katharine was closest to Alexander. She was also close to Emma Hale Smith, and her sons will serve as pallbearers at Emma Hale Smith's Bideman's funeral in Nauvoo. And so they were very close to Emma's family. And, something that's interesting is that Lucy Mack Smith is afforded the privilege of speaking at a general conference in Nauvoo. And very similarly, Katharine is also afforded that privilege. She spoke in Iowa. I think this picture was taken in Burlington, Iowa. And she also traveled to the conferences of the church, the general conferences held at Lamoni and also in Independence. She will be present at many of those, especially in the 1880s and 1890s. One of the most detailed accounts comes in 1895, where Katharine will speak several times in the conference. There's a reporter that's there that describes what was said, but also kind of gives you a feel for the audience. Said several times she was overcome with emotion during her allusion to former scenes as the congregation listened with rapt attention. Prayers of thankfulness were offered by many members for the privilege and blessing of having Mrs. Salisbury present. There is something in the aged woman, recounted the reporter who had listened to Katharine's gripping narrative, in the knowledge of her long and strange experiences that attracts the attention of all who hear her. And as time went on, Katharine begins to have a birthday celebration each year out in Fountain Green where she lived. And eventually word spread that it becomes not just the family who's gathering, but you have newspaper reporters, dignitaries who are gathering to get her recollections of the early history in Hancock County, Illinois. And Katharine was always very temperate in how she described that history. Some are asking her about, what was the persecution like? And she could have talked about not just in Nauvoo in that period. She had another 50 years, almost 60 years there in Hancock County and experienced a lot of difficulties and hardships, religious persecution. But she doesn't talk about that. She's very temperate in how she talks about it. She even tells her children at one point, what my brother Joseph, your uncle Joseph, was saying was hard for people to accept. And so we need to understand that, she would say to her grandchildren. She'd often recount to her grandchildren at these birthday celebrations, those early events of the Restoration, her being present at the organization of the church, the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, the first vision, many of those kinds of details she would recount to her grandchildren. One funny story is that she would talk about, one of the things she'd always talk about is the minister who rejected Joseph's account of the first vision. And she said, one of the grandchildren said that when she would recount that, we'd raise our fists in protest of how the Smith family were treated. And Katharine again would tell them to be temperate, to not retaliate, to not get bitter about that persecution. So she was a great example of that. And maybe I'll just close with this quote. This comes from Warren Orr, who actually served as a judge of the Illinois Supreme Court and who knew the family. He's writing this to Solomon, but I think it applies to the whole Salisbury family. Your life exemplifies the truth of the sometimes doubted statement that right will prevail in the end. When one reads of your early hardships and the persecutions and impositions you suffered at the hands of ignorance and poisoned-minded intolerance, and yet sees that you had the courage enough to stand up and tolerate the weaknesses of others and finally conquer their love and respect by your own good living, it gives one hope for the future. And so just a remarkable life. I see Katharine as a person who was able to endure those hardships through her paradigm of faith and reliance upon God, and dealt with a lot of challenges through her life. So thank you for listening this evening. I'm grateful to be able to share a little bit about Katharine and her remarkable life.
And we are grateful that you shared about Katharine and her remarkable life. I think it's fair to say that many of us here tonight knew very little about Katharine before reading your biography and listening to your presentation tonight. Thank you so much for highlighting her story. And the photographs are great. I'm going to reach out to you afterwards to see if I can get a copy of some of those images. They were fantastic. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for helping us launch the new series, for sharing your knowledge about Katharine Smith Salisbury. We've learned a lot tonight, and there's still so much more to learn. So thank you so much for carving out time to share with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Also, a big thank you to Peter and Wendy for helping out behind the scenes and always making things look so easy. Lastly, we share our thanks to all of you, our dear friends in the audience, for being the ones who make these nights happen. Thank you for your love of a good story and for supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, not only tonight, but throughout the year. Thank you. Thank you. I encourage all of you to tune in next Thursday as we welcome Cheryl Bruno and John Dinger. Our guests will explore the highlights of their new biography that's called Come Up Hither to Zion, William Marks and the Mormon Concept of Gathering. William Marks was an early convert who quickly gained the trust of Joseph Smith Jr. He was known throughout the church and served in a number of significant leadership positions in 1830s Kirtland as well as 1840s Nauvoo. Well, after the death of Joseph Smith Jr., Marks joined a variety of restoration movements, but often left. Eventually, he found the Reorganized or the Community of Christ movement, and his presence in the church helped convince Joseph Smith III to join and lead the reorganization. Because William Marks was trusted by leaders and members alike, he was eventually called to the first presidency, where he served until his death in 1872. There's a lot to learn about William Marks. So join us next week as we learn more about this fascinating person from church history. Wendy will drop the registration link in the chats for us. So until next time, friends, keep reading your church history and please do take care. We'll see you next Thursday.